So listen, last week we ended on a dramatic story, didn't we, of 9 plagues that God brought on the Egyptians and warning them of his coming judgment. And at the end of the passage last week, what we saw was Moses warning Pharaoh of the 10th plague and the final judgment, which would be the death of the firstborn in all of Egypt. And this evening we're going to look at the details of how that was played out. And we've read the whole passage. And we've done that because of the weight of the passage, because of the weight of the detail. But we're going to see, firstly, what God gives is a solemn warning. I'm going to go back to chapter 11, verse 1, like we saw last week, because that's really integral to this chapter. It says this: "I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely." So we saw last week, God says to Moses, go and warn Pharaoh. Moses delivers that warning, and Pharaoh hardens his heart. And the chapter gives details about what will happen in that final plague. And it's important to notice that this plague is on absolutely every single household in Egypt. Not one would be spared. Every firstborn in Egypt was under judgment because there was not one house in Egypt without sin. Now, to give you an idea of the impact of that judgment, can I ask you to stand up if you are the firstborn of your household? Bang. Isn't that frightening? That's a lot of us, isn't it? And it's a big judgment. Imagine the trauma. You can sit down now. I was making you stand for effect. But imagine the trauma and heartbreak if everyone standing, or everyone who stood up in the room, was found dead tomorrow morning. No wonder the sound of wailing went throughout the nation. And the judgment teaches us important lessons, doesn't it? Particularly how much sin offends God and how weighty his judgment is against sinners. You might be thinking this evening, well, what is this word sin? What's it all about? Well, sin is an attitude of our hearts, a nature, if you like, of each one of us that says we don't want to come under God's authority. So chapter 11 is in the Bible to tell us that all who live like that, as Pharaoh did, will be judged by God. And Pharaoh, as we've seen over the last few chapters of Exodus, chose not to listen to God's warning time and time and time again. Isn't that just, doesn't it resonate with our hearts? I hear you, God, but I'm just not going to listen. I hear you, God, but I'm going to justify my sin. I'm right in the way that I go. And we can't distance ourselves from Pharaoh because we too are sinners. We too don't like the idea of God's loving rule over us. And some of us express that actively. We take every opportunity to reject God's ways and God's authority. Others of us do that passively. We obey God, we do the church thing well, as long as it's convenient for us. But when it's not, when God asks us to do that hard thing, like say, sorry to our brothers or sisters, that's like, I don't know, growing up, that was the hardest thing for me to do. Well, actually we say to God, no. They've got to do that first. We find ourselves using God to make us feel better rather than genuinely wanting to know him for the sake of knowing him. And just like with God's final warning to Pharaoh, we too are challenged to open our eyes to God's coming judgment. So our whole passage, the chapter that we've read this evening, is a reminder that when we die, we will be judged for the way that we have treated God. And on our own, there is no escape from his judgment. So that's a solemn warning. But the second point is God provides shelter from his judgment. So look at chapter 12, verse 3 with me. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small, they must share. If any house is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs, literally just to sprinkle it on. These are the very specific, they're really, really specific instructions, aren't they? The lamb had to be a 1-year-old male in its prime, had to be perfect, had to be the right size, had to be the right number of lambs for the household. And at twilight, on the 14th day of the month, over 500,000 lambs were slaughtered throughout the Israelite community. And then thousands of liters of blood sprinkled over the doorposts. What a sight, what a smell, what a sound. And you have to ask, why the fuss? Why do these things? Well, the fuss is because they're a graphic reminder that satisfying God's anger at our sin is not easy. God will not just click his fingers and declare our sin deleted. With God, justice must be done. Sin must be punished. The debt of our sin must be paid because God is absolutely, totally fair, frighteningly fair. God rightly demands the punishment of death be paid for sins of the people. And that's the point of the lamb. Because rather than the firstborn die, God provides another, a sacrifice to take the punishment of death in the place of the firstborn of Israel. And it couldn't be any old sacrifice. And that brings us to our middle of this talk question, which is this. Hopefully it appears on the screen behind me. The lamb was a perfect lamb, a costly lamb, assigned to God and the people. But why did the lamb need to be perfect? Why did the lamb need to be costly? And what was the sign to God and to the people? So have a chat on your tables. Hopefully that's a bit of a get your creative juices flowing, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Well, listen, I'm going to draw us back together. And I hope as we're thinking on these things, I hope there is a sense of almost the weight, almost the seriousness of what was going on that night. The lamb had to be perfect. And the reason it had to be perfect was because it was going to take someone else's place. And it's a picture of the fact that the imperfect cannot take another's place before the judgment of God. Because they would have to be firstly judged for their own imperfections. But secondly, it was a costly sacrifice. A costly sacrifice represented a big debt. It wasn't a case of grabbing, as our table said, a wheezy old ewe who was headed for the knacker's yard and chopping her up. The lamb was in its prime. In today's values, we're talking over £100,000 worth of beautiful, beautiful ram. Multiply that by however many households there were. The lamb had to be in its prime, the pride of the flock. And then the blood on the doorpost was a sign they had to put their complete trust in God to save them from his judgment. The blood on that doorpost sprinkled was a sign of their faith in his way of salvation from his coming wrath. And that's where our passage begins to help us understand Jesus coming into this world. Because what we see in these chapters is an event that points forward to the work that Jesus did when he died on the cross. You see, because of the way we treat God, God is angry at us, just as he was angry at the Egyptians. But at the same time, he loves us deeply, so he wants us to be rescued from his judgment, just like his people. And that's why Jesus came to earth. He came to earth to die under God's judgment instead of us. He's the sacrifice, like the lamb in our passage. Actually, one character in the New Testament called John the Baptist, when he sees Jesus for the first time, he says and declares to everyone standing there, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." So Jesus is a perfect sacrifice. And that means because he's perfect, he's sinless, he's able to stand in another's place and take the wrath of God. So 2 Corinthians 5:21 declares this. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. God made him who had no sin, Jesus, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. As Jesus hung on the cross, the anger of God at our sin was poured out on him. And he took our sin upon himself. And he was judged for it instead of us. And then even more than that, because he was perfect and right with God, and because he became imperfect and under God's wrath, his perfection is transferred to us. So when God looks at all those who trust in him, he doesn't see our sin. He sees Christ's perfection covering us like a robe. And just like the sacrificial lamb, Jesus was a costly sacrifice in his prime. What was his worth? God's Son. What was his character, his nature? Here's how beautiful he was. He willingly became the sacrifice to take away our sin. And Jesus' blood was the sign. Ephesians 2:13 tells us, "But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ." As Jesus' blood ran down his body onto the ground around his cross, the sign to God was simple. All who trust in Jesus will be forgiven. All who believe in Jesus, who listen to his claim to forgive our sin as God, come under his protection from God's wrath. His blood is the sign to God that all who trust in him have protection from God's anger. So can you see the parallel between Exodus 12 and Mark 15, where Jesus dies? In Exodus 12, the sprinkled blood on the doorposts of those Israelite houses tell God they've sacrificed a substitute so death could pass. Death had already been executed on that house, and the angel of death could pass over. And with Christ on the cross, his blood that was sprinkling down from that cross tells God that all who trust in him have a substitute who has paid the death that we deserve because of our sin. It's a picture, isn't it? What a picture. How do we come under the blood of the Lamb? How do we come under Christ's shed blood on the cross? Well, do you know you talk to Jesus? He rose again from the dead, so he is alive today. And if you're not trusting in him, the perfect sacrifice of God, come to take away the sin of the world, then God's invitation is to talk to him, to ask him to forgive you, because as a sinner like me, like everyone here, we need salvation from God's coming judgment, and Jesus willingly offers it. But you know, the final thing this chapter teaches us is to remember what God has done. Remember what God has done. Now imagine this is one of those events that those who were there would have never forgotten. That's pretty obvious, but actually this event was so significant and so momentous that it would have needed to be it would need to be remembered by the people who weren't there. Its significance would go beyond the next generation and into the next and dozens of generations. Why? Because they were being saved to be God's people. I don't know whether you remember a few weeks back, chapter 6, God says this, he promises this to Moses in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. Isn't that what God does? I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. So this day changed the Israelites from being just a bunch of slaves hanging around for 430 years, descended from Jacob, and made them into a nation, the nation of Israel, God's people. A saved nation, a chosen nation, an appointed nation, a belonging nation. And God wanted that nation to know the things happened, that the things happening on that night were important, and they marked them out for every generation to come. That he saved them out of slavery. And he led them into nationhood and belonging to God. Which is why he institutes all those solemn rituals which are detailed in chapter 12 and go into chapter 13. And they're about remembering. They were to reenact the Passover meal itself every year. They were to remember God's salvation and their helplessness to save themselves from his judgment. They were told to dedicate every firstborn son belonging to God. They were to remember belonging to God as a nation. That's what this is about. And this is the point. God intended for each generation born to see all that was going on at Passover and to go, what's that all about? Why all these funny little rituals at this time of year? And it was intended for the parents to say, well, let me tell you about what God had done for his nation in the Exodus. It's a dramatic history lesson, isn't it? Each time, every year, they celebrated Passover, they reenacted the events in a way that brought out what it meant to be Israel. The Lamb died in their place. God redeemed the whole nation out of slavery. He brought them, he bought them, and they belonged to him in a special way. That meant they needed to be different to the nations around them. It meant they owed their very lives to God. And if you're a Christian here tonight, it's good to remember that we too have been saved by God in a new and a greater way. Peter says that by Jesus' precious blood, we've been redeemed or saved from the empty way of life handed down to us by our forefathers. And then a little later on, he says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Now, in many ways, our greatest point of application this evening is what we're about to do, the action of taking communion together. Because that is our festival of remembrance. And I hope, boys and girls and young people, I hope there's a sense in which as we take this communion, I want you to ask, if you don't know already, I want you to ask, what is going on here? Why does this church spend so much time meeting together and having a little cube of bread and a little sip of grape juice? What's the significance? Why do we do it? And if you're asked that question as a parent or a grown-up or a youth leader, point to Jesus. because of what he's done for us. He is the spotless Lamb, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And we celebrate his death and his resurrection as we eat together. Now, just before we go on to do that, let's just spend a little bit of time around our tables, looking at 1 Peter 2, verse 9, and focusing on the fact that we now belong to God as his people. And so there are just a couple of questions which I'm hoping will appear on the screen. Behind me, great. So I'm looking at that screen, and let's chat those through. Also in just a sense of thankfulness, of joy, of belongingness, and then we'll take communion together.